This is an educational documentary presented for historical and educational purposes only. Hey guys, tonight we walk softly into the shadow of a man whose name once pulsed through every television screen, every airport terminal, every whispered late-night conversation about safety and fear. You can almost feel it already, that strange, heavy quiet that settles in just before history tilts. Imagine standing in a calm suburban neighbourhood in America in the late 1990s. Lawns trimmed, porch lights glowing. The world feels stable, predictable, humming along in familiar rhythms. You think tomorrow will look like today. You assume the sky above you is just sky. And somewhere far away, in a different landscape of sand and stone, another rhythm is beating. One that you probably won't survive in the way you expect, at least not unchanged. Because the story of Osama bin Laden is not just about one man hiding in mountains, it is about the fragile illusion of distance, and how quickly it can collapse. So, before we go any further, if this quiet space makes you feel even a little less alone, you can like the video and subscribe, but only if it feels right to your heart. And hey, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Are you lying awake in a quiet room at 2 am? Or maybe starting your day in a rainy city, eyes still heavy? Drop your time and place in the comments. Let's remind each other we're not alone out here. Now, dim the lights, let your shoulders relax, and let's begin tonight's slow, strange journey, together, here on Timeless Sleep. You begin not with explosions or headlines, but with stillness. The kind of stillness that makes you forget how quickly things can break. In the final years of the 20th century, the United States stands as the world's only superpower after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, a mainstream historical fact that shapes everything about this story. The Cold War is over. The Berlin Wall is a memory. The economy is strong, the internet is blooming, and optimism feels almost automatic. You walk through airports without removing your shoes. You greet strangers at gates. The word terrorism exists, yes, but it feels distant, a term tucked into foreign news segments, not woven into daily life. And yet, thousands of miles away, in parts of the Middle East and South Asia, resentment is quietly fermenting. You have to picture it like heat trapped under desert sand, invisible until it burns your feet. Osama bin Laden, a tall, soft-spoken Saudi exile, is not yet a household name to you. To many in the West, he is barely known at all, but within certain circles, his voice is growing louder, sharper. He speaks of humiliation, of occupation, of holy duty. He speaks in recorded messages that travel farther than you might imagine, slipping across borders like wind through cracks. You feel the tension building, though you don't yet know why. It is there in the uneasy relationship between the United States and parts of the Muslim world, shaped by decades of foreign policy decisions, military deployments, and alliances. In 1990, when Iraq invades Kuwait, American troops deploy to Saudi Arabia during the Gulf War. That presence, foreign soldiers stationed near Islam's holiest sites, becomes one of the grievances bin Laden will later cite again and again. To you, it was a necessary strategic move at the time, part of geopolitics. To him, it becomes proof of corruption and betrayal by local rulers. You can almost see him in your mind now, lean, bearded, speaking calmly into a camera, not shouting but persuading. That calmness is unsettling. He frames his argument not as chaos but as correction, not as destruction but as defence. The world in his narrative is divided into believers and enemies, and compromise feels like weakness. This worldview doesn't appear overnight. It grows slowly, shaped by wars you barely paid attention to, and ideologies you never studied in school. You walk through a mall in 1998. Music plays overhead. News screens flash headlines about politics, sports, maybe a celebrity scandal. Meanwhile, that same year, US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania are bombed by Al-Qaeda operatives, another widely known historical fact. Hundreds are killed. You hear about it, of course. It is tragic, shocking, but still, it feels far away. Africa is not your street, not your skyline. You mourn briefly and then return to routine. The distance protects you, or so it seems. What you don't see is how these events are steps in a longer staircase. Each attack, each declaration, each recording released from a hidden location is part of a deliberate escalation. Bin Laden is testing boundaries, probing responses, learning how the most powerful nation on Earth reacts. You might imagine world leaders sitting around polished tables, studying grainy footage, debating what to do. Some argue for limited retaliation, others for overwhelming force. And still, life goes on. The 1990s roll forward with their dial-up internet tones and boy band soundtracks, blissfully unaware of how fragile the calm really is. There is something almost eerie about the normalcy of that era when you look back from the future. You check your email, you plan vacations, you board flights with a paper ticket tucked into your pocket. The idea that commercial aeroplanes could be turned into weapons on a massive scale does not dominate your imagination. It exists perhaps in action movies, not in policy briefings. You trust the system because you have always trusted it. Meanwhile, in places with names that sound distant and rugged, Kandahar, Jalalabad, training camps operate quietly. Men gather, not in grand armies, but in small groups, studying, planning, preparing. The scale is smaller than you might expect, and that is part of the danger. It does not look like a conventional war. There are no marching battalions crossing borders. There are conversations, encrypted messages, coded trust networks. The threat is asymmetric, a word that will soon become painfully familiar. You might wonder, lying there in the soft dark of your room, how one individual can bend the arc of global history. The answer is uncomfortable. He cannot do it alone. It takes followers, financiers, overlooked warning signs, miscalculations. It takes ideology meeting opportunity. Bin Laden becomes a symbol, yes, but also a catalyst accelerating forces that were already in motion. Anti-American sentiment in certain regions, anger at authoritarian governments, frustration over sanctions and wars, all of it swirls together. And you, without realizing it, are already part of the story. Because the decisions made in response to him will affect airport security lines you stand in, wars funded by your taxes, news cycles that shape your sense of safety. You may never meet him, never hear his voice directly, but his shadow stretches across your daily routines. For now, though, you are still in that pre-storm quiet. The sky looks ordinary. The world map in your classroom still feels static, not about to be redrawn by conflict. You breathe in and out, unaware that within a few short years, a single morning will fracture the illusion of invulnerability and etch a date, September 11th, 2001, into collective memory. That morning is coming, but we are not there yet. We are still in the slow inhale before the plunge, standing on the edge of a story that will change laws, borders, and the architecture of fear itself. You feel the air shift, just slightly. Not enough to panic, just enough to sense that history is leaning forward, preparing to move. And somewhere, in a place far from your quiet street, a man you barely know is already imagining the moment the world will finally say his name. You drift backward now, away from the looming storm, and into the bright heat of Saudi Arabia in the 1950s and 60s, where the story of Osama bin Laden begins not in a cave or a training camp, but in privilege. You stand in Jeddah, a port city along the Red Sea, where the air smells faintly of salt and dust, and construction cranes rise like metal skeletons against the skyline. Oil wealth is transforming the kingdom at astonishing speed. Roads stretch where sand once ruled, palaces and government buildings climb upward. And at the centre of this construction boom is the Bin Laden family, led by Mohammed bin Laden, a Yemeni immigrant who builds a vast fortune through his company, the Saudi Bin Laden Group. This is not myth. It is a well-documented historical fact that the family becomes one of the wealthiest and most influential in the kingdom, entrusted with major construction projects, even renovations to Islam's holiest sites in Mecca and Medina. You can almost hear the hum of machinery and the low murmur of business negotiations that shape a dynasty. Osama is born in 1957, one of dozens of children in a sprawling, complex family. Depending on the count, he is said to be the 17th son, though exact numbers blur in the maze of half-siblings. His father's wealth ensures that he grows up in comfort, surrounded by opportunity. You might expect a future businessman, a polished executive stepping into inherited power. Instead, you find a quiet, serious boy with a thin frame and intense eyes, more inclined toward religious devotion than flashy displays of wealth. His childhood unfolds in a Saudi Arabia that is both traditional and rapidly modernizing, pulled between strict interpretations of Islam and the temptations of global commerce. You can picture him attending elite schools, learning both religious studies and secular subjects, absorbing lessons about faith, obedience, and identity. When his father dies in a plane crash in 1967, the family fortune does not vanish, it is managed and distributed among heirs. Osama remains financially secure. There is no poverty pushing him toward desperation. That detail matters, because it complicates the narrative. You cannot reduce his later path to simple economic hardship. He grows up with access to education, connections, and the comfort of knowing he belongs to one of the kingdom's most respected families. Yet, privilege does not shield him from ideology. In fact, it may amplify his reach. As you follow him into his teenage years, you sense a tightening seriousness. Saudi Arabia in the 1970s is steeped in conservative religious currents. The influence of Wahhabism, a strict puritanical interpretation of Sunni Islam, shapes public life. Religious scholars hold authority. Sermons echo through mosques, reinforcing moral codes and communal obligations. Osama gravitates toward this environment with unusual intensity. Former classmates later describe him as polite, soft-spoken, even shy, but deeply devout. He memorizes religious texts, spends long hours in prayer, and listens closely to scholars who frame global politics as a struggle between belief and corruption. You walk beside him onto the campus of King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah in the mid-1970s. It is here that ideas begin to crystallize. Universities are not just lecture halls, they are crossroads of ideology. Professors from across the Arab world bring with them political grievances and theological arguments. Among the influential figures connected to the intellectual environment of that time is Abdullah Azzam, a Palestinian cleric who will later become a key proponent of armed jihad against foreign occupation. While historians debate the exact depth of their early relationship, it is widely accepted that Azzam's teachings significantly shape bin Laden's worldview. You can imagine the young student listening, absorbing the idea that defending Muslim lands is not merely political, but sacred, an obligation that transcends borders. Outside the campus gates, the Middle East is restless. The memory of the 1967 Six-Day War still stings across Arab societies. The 1973 oil embargo has demonstrated the region's power, but also deepened tensions with the West. You feel how global events seep into private conversations, discussions about Palestine, about secular Arab governments, about Western influence. They are not abstract debates, they are emotional, layered with humiliation and hope. For someone like Osama, already inclined toward rigid interpretations of faith, these narratives reinforce a sense of mission. Yet at this stage, there is no global terror network. There is no mastermind in hiding. There is a young man shaped by wealth, religion, and a region in flux. He marries young, as is common in his culture, and begins building a family life that appears conventional on the surface. If you were to glance at him then, you might see a tall, reserved Saudi heir with a beard and traditional robes, more businessman than militant. The transformation that will come later is not inevitable in this moment. It is seeded, yes, but not yet fully formed. You have to pay attention to the interplay between personal conviction and historical context. The late 1970s bring a seismic shift. In 1979, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. This is another central historical fact, and it will alter the trajectory of bin Laden's life profoundly. Across the Muslim world, the invasion is framed by many clerics as an assault on a Muslim nation by an atheist superpower. Calls for jihad, in the sense of armed struggle, spread quickly. Fundraising campaigns begin. Volunteers are encouraged to travel to Afghanistan to support the resistance. You can feel the pull of this moment. For a devout young Saudi, with wealth, connections, and a growing belief in religious duty, Afghanistan becomes more than a distant conflict. it becomes a proving ground. He is not yet the figure who will declare war on the United States, but the idea of participating in a transnational struggle begins to take hold. The combination of personal resources and ideological motivation is powerful. Unlike many volunteers, he can finance travel, supply equipment, and leverage networks built through his family's business empire. Before he ever sets foot in a war zone, though, the foundation is laid in these formative years. The sermons, the university lectures, the political grievances, the sense of belonging to a global Muslim community, all of it shapes his identity. You begin to see how a privileged upbringing does not contradict radicalization, it can coexist with it. Wealth provides mobility, education provides articulation, religious conviction provides justification. As you lie there listening, you might find it unsettling that there is no single dramatic turning point yet, no lightning strike of villainy. Instead, there is accumulation of ideas, influences, and opportunities. The young Osama bin Laden does not wake up one morning as the architect of global terror. He moves gradually, step by step, toward a worldview that frames violence as sacred duty and compromise as betrayal. And as the Soviet tanks roll into Afghanistan, grinding across rugged terrain thousands of miles from Jeddah, you sense the next chapter approaching. The quiet student, shaped by privilege and piety, is about to step beyond lecture halls and into a war that will redefine him, and, eventually, reshape the world you thought was so stable. You feel the air change as the 1980s begin, as though the dry heat of Jeddah gives way to the sharper, thinner air of the Afghan mountains. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 does not remain a distant headline for long. It becomes a magnet, pulling thousands of volunteers from across the Muslim world into what they see as a defensive jihad. You watch Osama bin Laden, still in his early 20s, shift from student and heir to participant. At first, his role is not that of a battlefield commander charging through gunfire. It is logistical, financial, organisational. He travels to Pakistan, which becomes the primary staging ground for foreign fighters entering Afghanistan. In cities like Peshawar, guest houses fill with young men carrying more conviction than experience. Money flows in from donors across the Middle East. Weapons arrive through complex channels, many of them indirectly supported by global powers who see the Afghan resistance as a useful counterweight to Soviet expansion. This is a critical historical reality. During the 1980s, the United States, through the CIA, provides support to Afghan Mujahideen factions as part of its Cold War strategy, although the extent and nature of any direct contact with bin Laden himself remains debated and often exaggerated in popular imagination. You stand at the edge of this chaotic convergence of ideology and geopolitics. Bin Laden uses his family wealth to help fund infrastructure for the fighters, roads, tunnels, supply routes carved into unforgiving terrain. He establishes guest houses to house incoming volunteers, and gradually his presence in the region becomes more than symbolic. He is not just writing checks, he is immersing himself in the cause. Photographs from that era show him in simple clothing, Kalashnikov slung over his shoulder, seated among other fighters. Whether his direct combat role was as extensive as some early legends claimed is still discussed by historians, but what is undeniable is that he builds credibility. He earns respect, not merely as a wealthy outsider, but as someone willing to endure the same harsh conditions as the men around him. The Afghan war is brutal, fought in jagged valleys and snow-covered passes. You imagine the constant rumble of distant artillery, the anxiety of ambush, the long nights spent under open skies. For bin Laden, this conflict becomes transformative. It reinforces the belief that a superpower can be resisted and even defeated through persistent, decentralized struggle. When the Soviet Union eventually withdraws its troops in 1989, after nearly a decade of grinding warfare, many in the region interpret it as a victory for faith over empire. That withdrawal is a widely recognized historical fact, and its psychological impact is immense. For bin Laden and others like him, it appears to validate the strategy of armed jihad against a global power. But as you follow him through these years, you notice something else forming beneath the surface. The networks built to support the Afghan jihad do not simply dissolve when the war winds down. Relationships forged in battle, trust established through shared risk, and financial channels created to move funds across borders all remain intact. In 1988, near the end of the conflict, bin Laden and close associates formalize a new organization. They call it Al-Qaeda, the base. At first, it functions as a database and logistical hub for foreign fighters, tracking who has come, who has trained, who might be mobilized again. It is not yet the globally infamous terror network it will become, but it is a structure, a scaffold ready to support future ambitions. You can sense the shift in scale. During the Afghan war, the enemy is geographically defined. Soviet forces occupying a Muslim country. The objective feels clear. But once the Soviets leave, the question arises, what next? Afghanistan descends into factional fighting among rival mujahideen groups, a civil war that disappoints those who dreamed of a unified Islamic state emerging from the ashes of occupation. Bin Laden grows increasingly disillusioned with regional politics. The focus of his rhetoric begins to widen. Instead of targeting only occupying armies, he speaks of broader enemies, of Western influence, of corrupt regimes propped up by foreign powers. You imagine him returning to Saudi Arabia briefly after the Soviet withdrawal. He is greeted with some admiration. Veterans of the Afghan jihad are seen by many as heroes who helped defeat a superpower. Yet tension simmers. In 1990, when Iraq invades Kuwait, and the Saudi government invites US troops onto its soil to defend against potential Iraqi aggression, bin Laden is furious. He reportedly offers to use his network of fighters to defend the kingdom instead of relying on non-Muslim forces. The Saudi leadership declines. This moment is pivotal. To him, the presence of American troops in the land of Islam's holiest sites is not strategic necessity, it is desecration. The grievance that had been abstract becomes personal. As you move through this period, you see how ideology hardens. Bin Laden's speeches grow more openly critical of the Saudi monarchy and of US foreign policy in the Middle East. He frames global politics as a binary struggle, stripping away nuance. The complexity of alliances, the calculations of statecraft, all of it is reduced to betrayal versus faithfulness. This simplification is powerful. It allows followers to see themselves as part of a grand moral narrative, rather than a messy political reality. At the same time, Al-Qaeda evolves quietly. Training camps in Afghanistan provide instruction not only in weapons handling, but in discipline, secrecy, and ideological commitment. Volunteers are vetted. Loyalty is emphasized. You sense the patience involved. This is not random violence, it is structured preparation. Bin Laden's leadership style blends charisma with a certain austere humility. He avoids ostentatious displays of wealth, reinforcing the image of a man devoted entirely to cause. That image will become central to his appeal among sympathizers. The broader world, meanwhile, is shifting. The Cold War is ending. The Soviet Union collapses in 1991, redrawing the global balance of power. The United States emerges as the dominant superpower. For many Americans, this is a moment of triumph and optimism. For bin Laden, it is confirmation that a single hegemon now stands in the way of what he envisions as an Islamic revival. His focus increasingly locks onto the United States as the primary obstacle. You lie there and consider how wars leave behind more than ruins, they leave behind mindsets. The Afghan jihad convinces him that determined fighters, armed with conviction and supported by decentralized networks, can challenge giants. That belief will shape every strategic decision that follows. It is a dangerous lesson, one drawn from a specific historical context, but applied far more broadly. As the 1980s fade into the early 1990s, the mountains of Afghanistan recede slightly from view, but the infrastructure created there remains. Al-Qaeda is no longer just a support network, it is becoming an organization with its own agenda. The young Saudi heir who once studied quietly in Jeddah has transformed into a seasoned organizer with international contacts and a growing sense of destiny. You feel the trajectory bending. not yet toward a single catastrophic morning, but toward a widening confrontation that will soon spill far beyond rugged valleys and into the heart of cities you recognise. The road ahead is not inevitable, but it is gathering momentum. And as bin Laden's rhetoric sharpens and his network solidifies, you sense that the war he once saw as regional is about to become something far larger, something aimed directly at the world you thought was safely distant from these mountains. You watch him step out of Afghanistan, not as a fading volunteer from a concluded war, but as a man searching for the next front. The early 1990s feel unsettled, like dust still hanging in the air after a building collapses. Afghanistan has not transformed into the unified Islamic State many fighters imagined. Instead, rival factions battle for control, turning Kabul into a fractured battlefield. Osama bin Laden, frustrated and increasingly vocal, returns to Saudi Arabia carrying not only the prestige of the Afghan jihad, but also a sharpened ideological edge. At first, he attempts to position himself as a reformer, criticising the monarchy's reliance on Western powers and condemning corruption. But criticism in Saudi Arabia, especially when it challenges the ruling family, is not a casual act. His speeches and letters circulate quietly, then more boldly. His frustration over the stationing of American troops in the kingdom after Iraq's invasion of Kuwait becomes central to his rhetoric. To him, it is proof that Muslim lands are under foreign influence and that local rulers have betrayed their duty. You sense how the relationship between bin Laden and the Saudi government deteriorates. In 1991, amid rising tensions and surveillance, he leaves the kingdom. His Saudi citizenship will later be revoked, severing formal ties to the homeland of his birth. He relocates to Sudan, a country undergoing its own ideological transformation under Islamist leader Hassan al-Turabi. Sudan in the early 1990s offers a kind of refuge, a place where Islamist movements are experimenting with governance and where bin Laden can operate with relative freedom. You picture him arriving not as a fugitive in rags, but as a wealthy investor with experience, contacts and ambition. In Sudan, he does not immediately build a headline-grabbing terror apparatus. Instead, he invests in businesses, agriculture, construction, infrastructure projects. Farms are established, roads are built. On the surface, it resembles legitimate enterprise, and to some extent it is. But these ventures also provide cover and logistical support for a growing network of militants. Training camps begin to take shape again, this time under a more formalised al-Qaeda structure. Veterans from Afghanistan gather, joined by new recruits inspired by the narrative of defeating a superpower. The organisation evolves from a loose database into a disciplined entity with hierarchy and long-term objectives. You begin to understand that this period in Sudan is less about spectacle and more about consolidation. Bin Laden refines his worldview. His speeches grow more pointed, focusing increasingly on the United States. He argues that American military presence in the Middle East, support for Israel, and sanctions against Iraq are not isolated policies, but components of a larger campaign against the Muslim world. Whether or not one agrees with his interpretation, it becomes clear that he sees the United States not just as an ally of regional regimes he opposes, but as the primary architect of what he considers injustice. During these years, al-Qaeda's activities begin to expand beyond rhetoric. Connections form with militant groups in other countries. The 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center in New York is carried out by extremists linked to radical networks, though al-Qaeda's direct operational role remains complex and debated among investigators. What is undeniable is that the attack signals a shift. Violence connected to Islamist extremism has reached American soil. 6 people are killed and thousands are injured. For many Americans, it is a shocking but isolated event. For bin Laden and his circle, it demonstrates both vulnerability and possibility. Pressure mounts on Sudan as international scrutiny increases. The United States designates Sudan a state sponsor of terrorism in 1993, and diplomatic pressure intensifies over the presence of extremist figures within its borders. By 1996, under growing international isolation and economic strain, Sudan expels bin Laden. You watch him relocate once more, this time back to Afghanistan, where a new force has risen to power, the Taliban. Emerging from the chaos of civil war, the Taliban seize Kabul in 1996 and impose a strict interpretation of Islamic law. They offer bin Laden sanctuary, and in return, he offers financial support and loyalty. Back in Afghanistan, the environment is harsher, more austere, gone are the relative comforts of Sudanese estates. Instead, you picture rugged compounds, mountains stretching under endless sky, an existence shaped by secrecy. Yet this isolation also provides protection. The Taliban leadership, particularly Mullah Omar, sees bin Laden as both an asset and a liability. He brings money and experienced fighters, but he also attracts global attention. Still, sanctuary is granted. In 1996, bin Laden issues a public declaration of jihad against American forces in Saudi Arabia. It is a formal escalation. He no longer confines his grievances to regional rulers. He names the United States directly as the enemy. 2 years later, in 1998, he co-signs another fatwa under the banner of the World Islamic Front, calling for attacks against Americans, civilian and military alike. This is not ambiguous rhetoric. It is a clear endorsement of violence on a global scale. For intelligence agencies, these statements are not abstract ideology, they are warnings. That same year, Al-Qaeda carries out coordinated bombings of US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, killing over 200 people and injuring thousands. The scale of the attacks shocks the international community. The bombings are meticulously planned, demonstrating that Al-Qaeda has evolved into a sophisticated operational network. In response, the United States launches cruise missile strikes against suspected training camps in Afghanistan and a pharmaceutical factory in Sudan, believed, at the time, to be linked to chemical weapons production. The strikes signal that bin Laden is no longer a peripheral figure. He is a declared enemy of the United States government. As you follow this trajectory, you sense the tightening spiral. Each action provokes a response. Each response reinforces his narrative of confrontation. In interviews with international journalists, bin Laden appears calm, composed, almost ascetic. He speaks in measured tones about duty and sacrifice. The contrast between demeanour and message is striking. He frames his campaign not as terrorism, but as defence against aggression. This reframing is central to his recruitment strategy. By portraying the United States as the aggressor, he casts his followers as reluctant warriors compelled by faith. Meanwhile, intelligence agencies track his movements, intercept communications, attempt to map a network that is deliberately diffuse. Al-Qaeda operates through cells, making infiltration difficult. Financing flows through charities, businesses, informal transfer systems. The structure is not a traditional army with uniforms and bases easily targeted. It is a web. You lie there and feel how the distance between continents begins to shrink. What once seemed like isolated regional grievances now connects directly to American embassies, American policies, American lives. The late 1990s hum with economic growth in the United States, yet beneath that prosperity runs a thread of unease. Reports surface of plots disrupted, warnings issued. The name Osama bin Laden begins appearing more frequently in news briefings. By the end of the decade, he is firmly established in Afghanistan under Taliban protection, leading an organisation that has declared open war on the United States. The stage is set for a confrontation far larger than embassy bombings or missile strikes. You can sense that the next move will not be symbolic, it will be seismic. The infrastructure is built, the ideology sharpened, the enemy clearly named. And as the world prepares to enter a new millennium filled with technological optimism and celebration, in remote compounds under mountain shadows, plans are already taking shape that will redefine what security means for generations to come. You move now into the final years of the 1990s, where the surface of the world feels glossy and confident, but underneath, currents are pulling towards something catastrophic. In Afghanistan, under Taliban protection, Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda are no longer improvising. The organisation has structure, discipline, and a clear enemy. Training camps operate in remote areas, drawing recruits from across the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond. Some come motivated by ideology, others by anger at specific policies, others by a search for belonging. They are trained not only in weapons and tactics, but in secrecy, patience and loyalty. You can imagine the routine, early prayers, physical drills, lectures reinforcing a worldview that divides the planet into camps of belief and opposition. The message is simple and relentless. The United States is the primary obstacle to what they frame as Islamic self-determination. By the late 1990s, American intelligence agencies are increasingly aware of the threat posed by al-Qaeda. The 1998 embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania have made that clear. The Us-Cole bombing in October 2000, carried out by al-Qaeda operatives in Yemen, kills 17 American sailors and injures dozens more. This is a confirmed historical event that further elevates bin Laden from extremist ideologue to urgent national security threat. You can feel the alarm rising in policy circles. Meetings are held, threat assessments circulate, yet the challenge is enormous. Al-Qaeda is not a state with obvious military bases or uniform divisions. It is a network operating across borders, exploiting weak governance and technological gaps. Inside Afghanistan, bin Laden's confidence appears to grow. Interviews released to international media show him composed, speaking of inevitable confrontation. He frames previous attacks as warnings, not endpoints. The rhetoric is no longer defensive in tone, it is anticipatory. He believes the United States can be drawn into conflicts that will drain its resources and morale, much as the Soviet Union was drained in Afghanistan. This comparison becomes central to his strategy. He studies the past and convinces himself that the same formula will work again: provoke, endure retaliation, and allow overreach to erode the opponent. You imagine the planning that begins to coalesce around an idea both audacious and chilling, using civilian aircraft as weapons. The concept is not entirely unprecedented in theory, but its scale will be unprecedented in practice. The plot that becomes known as the September 11 attacks involves careful selection of operatives, many of whom travel to the United States legally. They enroll in flight schools. They blend into communities. They move quietly, patiently. From the outside, they appear ordinary. Students, visitors, men navigating daily routines. That ordinariness is part of the plan. It lowers suspicion, buys time. In the United States, the late 1990s and early 2000s are marked by economic expansion and technological optimism. The dot-com boom reshapes industries. The idea of globalization is often framed as progress, borders becoming more permeable for trade, travel, and communication. Airports are busy, but not fortress-like. Cockpit doors are not heavily reinforced. Security procedures by later standards seem minimal. You can walk loved ones to the gate. You can carry small knives on board without triggering national panic. The assumption underlying the system is that hijackings, if they occur, are negotiations, not suicide missions. Within al-Qaeda, however, the logic is different. The chosen operatives are told that martyrdom is not a tragic outcome, but the ultimate success. Training intensifies. Money moves through discrete channels to fund travel and living expenses. Communication is compartmentalized so that no single arrest can unravel the entire plan. You sense the tension in these months, the quiet rehearsals, the coded messages. Intelligence agencies pick up fragments, warnings about possible attacks, references to aviation, but the pieces do not fully align in time. Osama bin Laden's role during this period is strategic rather than tactical in every detail. He approves, encourages, and frames the operation within his broader narrative of war. The exact degree of his involvement in operational specifics has been examined extensively, but it is widely accepted by investigators and later confirmed in statements that he was central to authorizing and supporting the plan. He sees it not merely as an attack, but as a spectacle, an event that will capture global attention and force the United States into a reaction. You lie there and consider how something so large can be prepared in relative quiet. The plotters exploit the openness of the societies they target. They use commercial infrastructure, flights, banking systems, schools against itself. It is a chilling inversion of trust. The modern world, built on mobility and connectivity, becomes vulnerable precisely because of those strengths. In 2001, the political landscape shifts slightly in Washington, with a new presidential administration taking office, but the threat environment remains complex. Counter-terrorism officials continue to warn of al-Qaeda's intentions. A now well-known intelligence brief in August 2001 mentions that bin Laden is determined to strike inside the United States. Yet determination does not equal detection. The machinery of government, vast and compartmentalised, struggles to convert warnings into precise prevention. Meanwhile, in Afghanistan, bin Laden remains under Taliban protection. The Taliban leadership is aware that his activities draw international pressure, but they do not expel him. Their alliance is ideological and strategic. He provides funds and fighters, they provide sanctuary. This mutual dependency allows the planning to proceed without significant interference on the ground. As summer 2001 fades, the operatives finalise details. Airline tickets are purchased. Teams are assigned to specific flights. The targets: the World Trade Center towers in New York, the Pentagon near Washington, D.C., and what is believed to have been either the US Capitol or the White House, are selected for symbolic and strategic impact. Financial power. Military command. Political leadership. The message is intended to be unmistakable. You feel the weight of inevitability now, though at the time nothing felt inevitable to those living through it. People board planes in early September with routine thoughts, meetings to attend, family to visit, vacations to enjoy. No one imagines that commercial airliners will be transformed into guided missiles. The attackers move through security checkpoints without triggering alarms that would later seem obvious. The system is not designed for what is about to happen. Back in Afghanistan, bin Laden waits. He has taken a gamble of historic proportions. He believes that a dramatic strike on American soil will provoke a response that ultimately benefits his cause. He underestimates certain consequences and overestimates others, but in his calculation, scale matters, shock matters, spectacle matters. And as you hover on the edge of that September morning, you can feel how the world is about to pivot. The years of preparation, the networks built from the Afghan war through Sudan and back again, the escalating rhetoric, the embassy bombings, the us coal, all of it has been leading here. The calm suburban streets, the bustling financial districts, the open airport gates, they are about to become part of a narrative that will redefine security, foreign policy, and daily life. You sense the inhale before impact, the split second before history fractures into before and after. You wake into the morning of September 11th, 2001, as if it is any other Tuesday. The sky over the east coast of the United States stretched wide and impossibly blue. Commuters pour into trains, taxis weave through Manhattan streets, office workers balance coffee cups and briefcases, and airplanes lift off from airports with the ordinary roar of engines that have carried millions safely before. There is no visible tremor in the air, no signal that within hours the world's most powerful nation will feel exposed in a way it has not in generations. The 4 flights selected by the attackers depart from Boston, Newark, and Washington, D.C., bound for California. On board, passengers settle into seats, flight attendants begin routine announcements, and cockpit crews follow checklists that have guided thousands of uneventful journeys. Then, within minutes of takeoff, the plan begins to unfold. Hijackers move with coordination, overpowering crews and taking control of the aircraft. Communication becomes fragmented and confused. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 crashes into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. The impact tears through floors filled with offices, instantly transforming an ordinary workday into chaos. For those watching from the street below, the sight is surreal. A gaping wound in steel and glass, smoke pouring upward into the clear sky. Many assume it is a tragic accident. News anchors struggle to piece together information in real time, their voices uncertain. 17 minutes later, at 9:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175 strikes the South Tower. The second impact is broadcast live on television, erasing any illusion of accident. The nation realizes it is under deliberate attack. This sequence of events is among the most documented and widely recognized in modern history, and yet the shock of it remains difficult to fully process even decades later. You can almost feel the collective intake of breath across the country, offices freezing mid-conversation, classrooms turning toward flickering screens, radios crackling with urgent updates. At 9:37 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 crashes into the Pentagon, the headquarters of the United States Department of Defense. Smoke rises from the massive building, symbol of American military power. Then, at 10:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 93 crashes into a field in Pennsylvania after passengers, aware through phone calls that other planes have been used as weapons, attempt to retake control. Investigations later conclude that the hijackers likely intended to strike either the US Capitol or the White House. The courage of those passengers prevents another direct hit on a central symbol of American governance. Within less than 2 hours, both towers of the World Trade Center collapse. The South Tower at 9:59 a.m., the North Tower at 10:28 a.m. The collapses send clouds of dust and debris surging through lower Manhattan, swallowing streets in grey darkness. Nearly 3,000 people are killed in the attacks, including civilians, firefighters, police officers, and emergency personnel. It becomes one of the deadliest terrorist acts in history. The numbers are staggering, but even they cannot fully convey the emotional rupture that follows. You feel how the sense of invulnerability fractures. For decades, Americans have watched wars unfold overseas, often separated by oceans. Now the battlefield has arrived in the heart of major cities. Airports across the country shut down. All civilian flights in US airspace are grounded, an unprecedented move. Fighter jets patrol skies that, hours earlier, felt routine and open. The stock market closes. Government buildings evacuate. Families struggle to reach loved ones as phone networks jam. In Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden initially denies direct involvement in the attacks, even as intelligence agencies quickly identify Al-Qaeda as the responsible organisation. Over time, through video recordings and statements released by Al-Qaeda, his role becomes undeniable. He frames the attacks as justified retaliation for American policies in the Middle East. In one later video, he expresses satisfaction that the operation exceeded his expectations in scale. These admissions solidify his position as the architect of the deadliest attack on US soil. You sense how rapidly the political atmosphere shifts. Within days, President George W. Bush addresses Congress and the nation, declaring that the United States will pursue those responsible and any nations that harbour them. The phrase war on terror enters public discourse, shaping policy for years to come. On September 14, 2001, Congress passes the authorization for use of military force, granting the president broad authority to target those linked to the attacks. This legal framework becomes the foundation for military operations not only in Afghanistan, but in other regions as well. International reaction is swift. NATO invokes Article 5 of its charter for the first time in history, declaring that an attack on one member is an attack on all. Allies express solidarity. Vigils are held around the world. Yet beneath the unity lies uncertainty about what comes next. Intelligence agencies intensify efforts to locate bin Laden and dismantle Al-Qaeda. The Taliban, under pressure to hand him over, refuse without evidence presented to them publicly, a stance that fails to satisfy US demands. As you sit with the weight of that morning, you realise that the attacks are not only acts of violence, but catalysts for structural change. Airport security transforms almost overnight. The Transportation Security Administration, WITS, is created in November 2001 to federalise airport screening. Cockpit doors are reinforced. Passenger screening becomes more rigorous. The Department of Homeland Security will soon be established, reorganising vast segments of the federal government around counter-terrorism priorities. Surveillance authorities expand through legislation such as the USA Patriot Act, passed in October 2001, increasing government powers to monitor communications in the name of national security. The cultural impact is equally profound. Fear becomes a daily undercurrent. Suspicion toward Muslims and those perceived as Middle Eastern rises sharply, leading to discrimination and hate crimes. Civil liberties debates intensify. The balance between security and freedom becomes a central political question. You feel how a single morning ripples outward into policies, attitudes, and global alignments. Meanwhile, in remote Afghan compounds, bin Laden becomes the most wanted man in the world. A massive intelligence and military apparatus begins to focus on his capture or death. Rewards are offered. Satellites scan rugged terrain. Human intelligence networks expand. The United States prepares for military action, arguing that the Taliban's refusal to expel al-Qaeda constitutes complicity. As smoke clears from Ground Zero in the Pentagon, the world settles into a new vocabulary: homeland security, sleeper cells, jihadist networks. The sense of distance that once shielded daily life is gone. Every airport announcement, every unattended bag, every unfamiliar face carries a faint echo of that September morning. The attacks have not only taken lives, they have redefined assumptions. And somewhere, in the mountains of Afghanistan, the man who orchestrated this rupture waits as the most powerful military in the world begins to move toward him. The storm that has been building for years has finally broken, and its consequences are only beginning to unfold. You feel the ground shift from shock to mobilization almost immediately after the towers fall. Grief is still raw, smoke still rising from the ruins in New York when plans for war begin to solidify. The United States demands that the Taliban hand over Osama, bin Laden, and dismantle al-Qaeda's infrastructure. The Taliban's leadership, entrenched in its rigid worldview and wary of surrendering a guest who pledged loyalty, refuses to comply with the ultimatum in the way Washington requires. Diplomacy falters quickly. On October 7, 2001, less than a month after the attacks, the United States and its allies launch Operation Enduring Freedom, initiating airstrikes against Taliban and al-Qaeda targets in Afghanistan. This is a clear historical turning point, the beginning of America's longest war. You imagine the first nights of bombing, flashes of light against mountain horizons, the rumble of explosions rolling through valleys that had already endured decades of conflict. US forces coordinate with the Northern Alliance, a coalition of Afghan factions opposed to the Taliban. Special operations units deploy on the ground, working alongside local fighters, calling in air support, moving rapidly through terrain that has humbled empires before. The Taliban's grip on major cities weakens under sustained assault. By November 2001, Kabul falls to anti-Taliban forces. Kandahar, the Taliban's spiritual heartland, follows in December. The regime that once provided sanctuary to bin Laden collapses with surprising speed. But collapsing a regime is not the same as capturing a man. Osama bin Laden does not stand in a capital waiting to surrender. He retreats into the mountainous border region between Afghanistan and Pakistan, particularly around Tora Bora, a rugged area of caves and narrow passes. Intelligence reports suggest he is there in late 2001. You can picture the hunt intensifying, US aircraft circling overhead, local militias combing rocky slopes, special forces navigating treacherous terrain. The Battle of Tora Bora becomes one of the most scrutinized episodes of the early war. Despite heavy bombardment and ground operations, bin Laden slips away. Later analyses debate how and why he escapes, whether insufficient troop levels, reliance on local allies, or the porous border with Pakistan allowed him to evade capture. What remains certain is that by early 2002, he is no longer within immediate reach. The failure to capture him at Tora Bora becomes a defining frustration. In the United States, the initial unity that followed 9/11 still holds, but questions begin to simmer beneath the surface. How could the most wanted man in the world vanish under such intense pressure? Intelligence agencies expand their efforts dramatically. The CIA increases operations in Pakistan's tribal areas. Drone surveillance programs begin to develop, though their widespread use will intensify in later years. Rewards for information on bin Laden climb into the tens of millions of dollars. His image circulates globally, on wanted posters, in news broadcasts, across newly expanding internet forums. Meanwhile, the broader war on terror expands beyond Afghanistan. In 2002 and 2003, the US government argues that Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, poses a threat through alleged weapons of mass destruction and potential links to terrorism. The invasion of Iraq in March 2003 opens a second major front. Although Iraq and Al-Qaeda are distinct entities, the regional upheaval creates new spaces for extremist groups to operate. Critics later argue that the diversion of resources and attention to Iraq may have complicated efforts to focus on bin Laden in Afghanistan and Pakistan. The strategic landscape becomes more complex, more diffuse. Back in the mountains and border towns, bin Laden adapts to life on the run. Communication becomes more cautious. Satellite phones, once used more freely, are largely abandoned after intelligence tracking proves effective. Couriers become central to his survival, carrying messages physically to avoid electronic interception. This reliance on trusted intermediaries will later become a crucial thread in locating him, but for now, it shields him from detection. You can imagine the rhythm of hiding, constant movement at first, shifting safe houses, relying on networks of loyalty built over decades. For ordinary Americans, daily life transforms in visible and invisible ways. National security alerts flash across television screens in colour-coded scales. Soldiers deploy repeatedly overseas. Families send loved ones to Afghanistan, then Iraq, uncertain when or if they will return. The sense of a clear endpoint fades. Instead of a swift capture and closure, the conflict stretches into years. Bin Laden releases occasional audio or video messages broadcast by networks like Al Jazeera, reminding the world that he is still alive. Each release triggers renewed media attention and political debate. His continued elusiveness becomes symbolic, a reminder that even the most powerful military cannot easily neutralize a decentralized threat. In Afghanistan, efforts shift toward rebuilding and stabilizing the country. A new government forms under President Hamid Karzai. International forces assist in training Afghan security forces and supporting reconstruction projects. Yet the Taliban regroup in rural areas and across the Pakistani border. Insurgency tactics, roadside bombs, ambushes, targeted assassinations become common. The war evolves from rapid regime change to protracted counterinsurgency. Bin Laden's direct operational role in day-to-day attacks appears limited compared to regional commanders, but his symbolic authority endures. He remains the ideological figurehead, the original architect of the confrontation. You sense the strain on all sides. For US troops navigating mountain passes and dusty villages, the enemy is often invisible, blending into terrain and civilian populations. For Afghan civilians, decades of conflict continue under new banners. For policymakers in Washington, balancing military objectives with political realities becomes increasingly difficult. The hunt for one man intertwines with the broader challenge of stabilizing an entire region. As years pass, intelligence agencies refine methods. They analyze captured documents, interrogate detainees, track financial transactions. Slowly, patterns begin to emerge around a small circle of couriers believed to be close to bin Laden. But at this stage, the trail remains faint. He is rumoured to be in caves, in remote valleys, perhaps even dead. Conspiracy theories circulate. Yet periodic recordings dispel the rumours, his voice measured, referencing current events to prove authenticity. You lie there and feel how time stretches. The initial fury of 2001 has cooled into something heavier: endurance, persistence. A grinding pursuit without clear visibility. Children who were in elementary school during 9/11 are now teenagers. Soldiers complete multiple deployments. The name Osama bin Laden remains fixed in public consciousness, but he has become almost spectral, a figure both omnipresent and unseen. The war that began with a promise of swift justice has become a long, complex campaign across mountains and borders, and somewhere beyond satellite images and intelligence briefings, the man at its centre continues to move quietly, trusting in distance, loyalty, and the difficulty of finding one individual in a region shaped by rugged geography and political ambiguity. The hunt is far from over, but it has entered a phase where patience, not shock, defines the struggle. You begin to notice that the story shifts from mountains and bombardments to something quieter, more methodical, almost invisible. After the early chaos of invasion and escape, the hunt for Osama bin Laden transforms into an intelligence puzzle stretched across continents. The public sees headlines about troop surges and roadside bombs, but behind closed doors analysts pore over fragments of information, searching for a thread strong enough to pull. By the mid-2000s, years have passed since Tora Bora. Bin Laden has not appeared in person, only through carefully staged video or audio recordings. Each message is dissected for clues, the background, the echo in his voice, the timing of references to global events. Intelligence agencies attempt to triangulate his location through scraps of data, but he has learned caution. Electronic communication is minimized. The network tightens around trusted couriers, men who carry messages by hand rather than by signal. You can almost see the analysts in dimly lit rooms, maps pinned to walls, names circled in red. One courier in particular begins to draw attention, known by a nom de guerre, eventually identified as Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti. Detainees captured in various operations mention him as a trusted messenger. At first, the references are vague. Some prisoners deny knowledge, others provide fragments that do not align. It takes years of interrogation, cross-referencing and patient analysis to build confidence that this courier may be a key to finding bin Laden. The process is slow, frustrating, filled with false leads, but persistence is its own weapon. Meanwhile, the war in Afghanistan grinds on. In 2009, President Barack Obama authorises a surge of US troops, aiming to reverse Taliban gains and create conditions for eventual withdrawal. The conflict has become America's longest war, spanning nearly a decade by this point. Public support wavers. Casualty numbers accumulate. The initial clarity of purpose, capture bin Laden, dismantle al-Qaeda, has blurred into broader goals of counterinsurgency and state building. Yet within the intelligence community, the search for bin Laden remains a central priority. In Pakistan, the situation is delicate. Officially, Pakistan is an ally in the war on terror, receiving substantial US aid. Unofficially, its border regions serve as refuge for various militant groups. The relationship between Washington and Islamabad is layered with cooperation and suspicion. Conducting operations on Pakistani soil without consent risks diplomatic fallout, yet intelligence suggests that the trail may lead there. The tribal areas along the border are vast and difficult to police, but by the late 2000s, attention shifts beyond remote mountains to something more surprising. Through surveillance and tracking of the courier's movements, analysts identify a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, a city not hidden in wilderness, but known for housing a major Pakistani military academy. The compound stands out. Built around 2004 or 2005, it is larger than neighbouring homes, surrounded by high walls topped with barbed wire. It has no visible telephone or internet connections. Residents burn their trash instead of leaving it for collection. The property's design suggests privacy bordering on secrecy. To intelligence officers, these anomalies raise questions. Why would a courier associated with al-Qaeda live in such a fortified residence in a relatively urban area? You imagine the cautious excitement in briefing rooms as satellite images are examined repeatedly. Patterns of life are studied. Who enters and leaves? How often? A tall figure is occasionally seen walking in the courtyard, but never photographed clearly enough for confirmation. Analysts debate probabilities. Is this truly bin Laden, or a decoy, or another senior figure? The absence of electronic signals both frustrates and intrigues. It suggests deliberate isolation. Inside the compound, life appears constrained. Family members move within high walls, rarely interacting with neighbours. Children reportedly do not attend local schools. Groceries are purchased by intermediaries. The isolation is intentional, a calculated effort to minimise exposure. For years, bin Laden has relied on rural remoteness. Now he may be hiding in plain sight, shielded by assumptions that he would never risk proximity to a major city, especially one with a military presence. By 2010, confidence grows that the compound's mysterious resident could indeed be the world's most wanted man. President Obama is briefed on the intelligence. Advisors present options, launch a drone strike to destroy the compound, conduct a joint operation with Pakistan, or execute a covert raid by US forces without informing Pakistani authorities in advance. Each choice carries risk. A drone strike might eliminate the target, but destroy evidence and kill family members. A joint operation risks leaks. A unilateral raid risks diplomatic crisis and potential military confrontation if discovered. You feel the weight of these deliberations. The decision is not simply tactical, it is geopolitical. Acting inside Pakistan without prior approval challenges sovereignty. Failing to act risks losing the opportunity if bin Laden relocates. Intelligence assessments never reach 100% certainty. Estimates vary, perhaps 60 to 80% probability that he is there. In matters of war, certainty is rare. Training begins in secret. A small team of US Navy SEALs from the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, commonly known as SEAL Team 6, rehearses the raid on a full-scale replica of the compound constructed in the United States. Helicopters are modified to reduce radar visibility. The operation is given a name, Neptune's Spear. Secrecy is paramount. Only a tight circle of officials is informed. Even within the military, knowledge is compartmentalized. As you lie there, you can sense the tension building again, but this time it is not the reckless audacity of a terror plot. It is the measured preparation of a state response, informed by years of failure and persistence. The hunt that began in Afghan mountains has narrowed to a single address in Abbottabad. Analysts continue to monitor the compound, watching for patterns that confirm suspicions. The tall figure in the courtyard becomes a focal point. They call him the Pacer, observed walking in small circles for exercise. The date approaches in early May 2011. Weather forecasts are checked. Moonlight conditions are considered. The risk of mechanical failure, of firefights, of diplomatic fallout, all weighed against the possibility of finally ending the decade-long pursuit. You feel how the story, which once exploded in fire and falling towers, has contracted into a quiet, high-stakes gamble carried out in darkness. For nearly 10 years, Osama bin Laden has evaded the most extensive manhunt in modern history. Now, behind high walls in a Pakistani city, the net appears to tighten. The decision has been made. Helicopters will lift off under cover of night, carrying a team trained for precision and speed. The world does not yet know that within hours another chapter will close, not with the shock of collapsing skyscrapers, but with the controlled urgency of a raid designed to end a pursuit that reshaped nations. You move into the night of May 1, 2011, though in Abbottabad it is already the early hours of May 2, and the air is still, thick with the kind of quiet that makes ordinary sounds feel amplified. In Jalalabad, Afghanistan, 2 modified Black Hawk helicopters lift off carrying members of the US Navy's elite SEAL Team 6, along with a translator and a military working dog. The operation has been rehearsed repeatedly in secret, each movement mapped out, contingencies layered upon contingencies. President Barack Obama and senior national security officials monitor the mission from the White House Situation Room, watching a live feed with limited visibility, aware that failure could mean not only the loss of American lives, but a severe international crisis. As the helicopters cross into Pakistani airspace, they fly low to avoid radar detection. The decision not to inform Pakistani authorities beforehand reflects deep mistrust and concern about leaks. The risk is enormous. If the mission is discovered mid-flight, it could trigger confrontation with Pakistani forces. Yet secrecy is deemed essential. You can imagine the tension inside the aircraft, the vibration of rotors, the weight of gear, the knowledge that the target is the most wanted man in the world. When the helicopters reach the compound in Abbottabad, the unexpected happens. One of the Black Hawks encounters aerodynamic issues caused by the compound's high walls and the warm night air. It loses lift and crash lands inside the courtyard. The pilots manage to bring it down without catastrophic damage, but the plan instantly shifts. Years of preparation must now adapt in seconds. The second helicopter lands safely outside the compound. The team moves quickly, blowing open doors, clearing rooms methodically. They encounter resistance from several occupants, including a courier identified as Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti and his brother. Shots are fired in close quarters. The mission's pace is relentless, driven by training and the awareness that time is limited. You sense how controlled the operation must be. The objective is clear: locate and identify Osama bin Laden, gather intelligence materials, and exit. On the upper floors of the compound, SEALs move through narrow hallways and stairwells. Women and children are present in the residence, adding complexity to every split-second decision. Then, on the third floor, they find him. Osama bin Laden is shot and killed during the raid. US officials later state that he did not surrender and that he posed a threat in the moment, though details of the encounter are subject to various accounts. What is undisputed is that after nearly a decade of pursuit, the man who orchestrated the September 11 attacks is dead. The team conducts a rapid on-site identification using facial recognition and other methods. They collect computers, hard drives, handwritten notes, and digital storage devices, an intelligence trove that analysts will later describe as one of the most significant in the war against Al-Qaeda. Before departing, they destroy the downed helicopter's remains to prevent sensitive technology from being recovered. Within approximately 40 minutes of landing, the team boards helicopters, one original and one replacement that had been called in, and departs Pakistani airspace. Back in Washington, confirmation is delivered. President Obama prepares to address the nation. Late on May 1, 2011, he announces that US forces have killed Osama bin Laden in a targeted operation in Pakistan. The news spreads instantly. Crowds gather outside the White House and at Ground Zero in New York, chanting, waving flags, expressing relief and triumph. For many Americans, it feels like a long-delayed chapter has closed. The face that had symbolized fear and anger for nearly 10 years is gone. You feel the mixture of emotions, satisfaction for some, solemn reflection for others. Nearly 3,000 lives were lost on September 11, 2001, and thousands more American and Allied service members have died in the wars that followed. The death of bin Laden does not undo that loss, but it carries symbolic weight. It signals that the United States can reach even the most elusive adversary. Yet almost immediately, new questions arise. How did bin Laden manage to live for years in Abbottabad, a city not far from Pakistan's capital and home to a major military academy? Was there complicity within Pakistani institutions, or was it a failure of intelligence? Pakistani officials expressed surprise and anger at the unilateral US operation on their soil. Diplomatic tensions flare. The relationship between Washington and Islamabad becomes more strained, marked by mutual accusations and mistrust. The handling of bin Laden's body is swift and deliberate. US officials state that he is buried at sea within 24 hours in accordance with Islamic practice, though some critics question the details and transparency of the process. The decision aims to prevent the creation of a physical gravesite that could become a shrine or rallying point for extremists. Photographs of his body are not released publicly, a choice defended by officials as necessary to avoid inflaming violence, but criticised by some who demand proof. As you sit with the aftermath, you realise that killing bin Laden does not instantly dismantle Al-Qaeda. The organisation has evolved, franchised, and decentralised. Leaders in Yemen, North Africa, and elsewhere continue operations. Ayman al-Zawahiri, bin Laden's deputy, assumes leadership. The ideology persists beyond the individual, yet his death marks a psychological turning point. The narrative of invincibility surrounding him is broken. The myth of permanent escape dissolves. The intelligence gathered from the Abbottabad compound provides insight into Al-Qaeda's inner workings, correspondence revealing strategic debates, operational guidance, and concerns about public perception. Analysts sift through thousands of documents, seeking to disrupt future plots. The raid itself becomes a case study in counter-terrorism operations, later dramatised in books and films, debated in policy forums, scrutinised for legal and ethical implications. You sense how the story, which began in privilege in Jeddah, travelled through Afghan battlefields, Sudanese compounds, global terror networks, and finally ended behind high walls in a Pakistani city. The arc is long and jagged. The man who once believed he could provoke a superpower into collapse has instead been tracked across a decade, by that same power's relentless intelligence apparatus. Yet even in this moment of apparent closure, the broader consequences remain. The wars launched in response to 9/11 continue. Debates over surveillance, detention and military intervention persist. The world that existed before that clear September morning in 2001 cannot be restored by a single raid. Bin Laden's death is an endpoint for a man, but not for the forces he set in motion. And as the night in Abbottabad settles back into uneasy quiet, you understand that history rarely ends cleanly. It shifts, adapts, carries forward the imprint of what came before. The hunt is over, but the world shaped by that hunt is still unfolding. You begin to see how the death of Osama bin Laden does not mark a clean break, but rather a transition into a more complicated, diffused era of conflict. In the immediate aftermath of the raid, political leaders frame the moment as justice delivered. Yet on the ground in Afghanistan and across parts of the Middle East, the realities remain layered and unresolved. Al-Qaeda does not dissolve with the loss of its founder. Instead, it adapts, leaning further into its decentralized model. Regional affiliates, some already operating with relative autonomy, continue attacks in places like Yemen, Somalia, and North Africa. The ideology bin Laden helped globalize proves more resilient than the man himself. You sense how the symbolic weight of his death contrasts with the persistence of instability. In Afghanistan, US and NATO forces remain engaged in counterinsurgency operations. The Taliban, though toppled from power in 2001, have never fully disappeared. By the early 2010s, they control or contest significant rural territory. The United States begins planning a gradual drawdown of troops, aiming to transition security responsibilities to Afghan forces. President Obama announces timelines for withdrawal, emphasizing that the mission to dismantle al-Qaeda's core leadership has largely succeeded. Yet success feels qualified. Al-Qaeda's central leadership in Afghanistan and Pakistan has been weakened, but the broader network has metastasized. In Iraq, the situation evolves differently, but with its own turbulence. The US invasion in 2003, initially justified on grounds separate from 9/11, has destabilized the region in ways few predicted fully. Out of the chaos emerges Al-Qaeda in Iraq, a group that later transforms into the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, Khanis. While ISIS and Al-Qaeda diverge ideologically and strategically, the lineage of transnational jihadist movements traces back through the networks and narratives shaped during bin Laden's era. You feel how the consequences of earlier decisions ripple outward, intersecting conflicts and creating new centres of violence. At home in the United States, the architecture of security built after 9/11 remains firmly in place. The Department of Homeland Security continues coordinating domestic preparedness. The USA Patriot Act and related surveillance programs shape debates over privacy and civil liberties. Airport security protocols, once tightened in urgency, become normalized. A generation grows up accustomed to removing shoes at checkpoints, to the language of terror alerts, to the presence of armed security in public spaces. The psychological shift is subtle but enduring. Even with bin Laden gone, the sense of vulnerability introduced in 2001 does not entirely fade. Internationally, the raid in Abbottabad raises complex questions about sovereignty and counterterrorism norms. The United States demonstrated that it was willing to act unilaterally within another country's borders to eliminate a high-value target. Supporters argue that Pakistan's inability or unwillingness to locate bin Laden justified the action. Critics warn that such precedents could erode international legal frameworks if replicated broadly. You sense how the balance between state sovereignty and counter-terrorism imperatives becomes a central tension in global politics. The intelligence materials recovered from the compound continue to be analysed for years. Documents reveal that bin Laden was concerned about maintaining relevance and about civilian casualties caused by affiliated groups, which he feared damaged al-Qaeda's image. He reportedly considered rebranding efforts and strategic adjustments. These insights complicate the simplistic image of a remote mastermind detached from events. Even in hiding, he remained engaged in strategic thinking, attempting to guide a movement that had grown beyond his direct control. As the 2010s progress, the Arab Spring reshapes parts of the Middle East. Popular uprisings topple long-standing leaders in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya. The motivations behind these movements are diverse: economic frustration, political repression, demands for reform, and not primarily driven by al-Qaeda's ideology. Yet, the upheaval creates power vacuums in some regions, offering space for extremist groups to expand. The Syrian civil war, beginning in 2011, becomes another arena where jihadist factions operate. You feel how the geopolitical landscape remains volatile, influenced but not solely defined by bin Laden's legacy. In Afghanistan, efforts to negotiate with the Taliban gain momentum over time. After years of combat, the United States seeks a political pathway to end its military involvement. In February 2020, the US and the Taliban sign an agreement in Doha, outlining conditions for American troop withdrawal. The agreement does not include the Afghan government as a full participant in the negotiations, a decision that proves controversial. By August 2021, US forces complete their withdrawal, and the Taliban rapidly regain control of Kabul. The images of evacuation flights departing the airport evoke painful echoes of past conflicts. The war that began in response to 9/11 ends not with a decisive victory ceremony, but with a complex and contested conclusion. You sit with the irony. Osama bin Laden sought to draw the United States into prolonged conflicts, believing that sustained military engagement would drain its power and will. 2 decades of war, trillions of dollars spent, and thousands of lives lost suggest that the cost has indeed been immense. Yet the United States remains a global power, its institutions intact. The outcome is neither the collapse bin Laden envisioned, nor the clean triumph some policymakers once predicted. It is something murkier, a landscape shaped by unintended consequences and hard-earned lessons. Within the broader Muslim world, debates continue about the impact of bin Laden's ideology. Many religious scholars and political leaders condemn his actions as distortions of faith. Others view him through lenses of resistance and grievance. The narrative is not uniform. It shifts across regions, generations, and experiences. You recognise that legacies are contested terrain, interpreted differently depending on perspective and proximity. Back in the quiet of your own space, you feel how the story has stretched across decades, continents, and political systems. The man who once moved from privilege in Saudi Arabia to war in Afghanistan and hiding in Pakistan has left a mark far beyond his physical presence. His death closed a chapter, but the book of global security, terrorism, and counterterrorism continues to write itself in new forms. And as the world adjusts to a reality without his voice appearing in grainy videos, the deeper questions linger. What balance between freedom and security will endure? How will nations respond to decentralized threats in an interconnected age? The shadow that once centered on one figure has diffused into a broader challenge, one that does not end with a single raid in the night, but evolves with each new generation, confronting the memory and consequences of what he set in motion. You begin to understand that legacy is not a single, solid monument, but a shifting landscape shaped by memory, policy, and time. After Osama bin Laden's death, governments, scholars, and citizens alike attempt to define what his era truly meant. For the United States, the attacks of September 11 and the long pursuit that followed become foundational experiences for an entire generation. Children who once watched smoke rise from New York's skyline grow into adults who have never known an America untouched by counter-terrorism measures. Military academies study the raid in Abbottabad as a case of precision and intelligence integration. Universities debate the legal frameworks of targeted killings and the expansion of executive power. The story becomes embedded in textbooks, documentaries, and public commemorations. At Ground Zero in New York, the site where the World Trade Center towers once stood transforms into a memorial and museum. 2 vast reflecting pools occupy the footprints of the towers, water cascading downward into a central void. The names of nearly 3,000 victims are inscribed in bronze panels surrounding the pools. Each year on September 11, families gather to read those names aloud. The ritual reinforces that behind geopolitics and ideology were individual lives, office workers, firefighters, airline passengers, parents, children. The memorial stands not as a tribute to bin Laden's power, but as a testament to the human cost of his decisions. In Washington, the Pentagon Memorial honors those killed in the attack there, with 184 illuminated benches arranged by birth year, stretching across a quiet, landscaped space. In Pennsylvania, the Flight 93 National Memorial marks the field where passengers resisted and prevented further destruction. These physical spaces anchor memory and geography, ensuring that the events remain tangible even as years pass. You sense how societies construct meaning through such sites, shaping collective understanding of trauma. Globally, the counter-terrorism framework that emerged after 9/11 becomes institutionalized. Intelligence sharing between nations increases. Surveillance technologies advance rapidly. Drone warfare expands as a preferred method for targeting militant leaders in remote areas. The ethical debates surrounding these practices intensify. Supporters argue that such tools prevent large-scale attacks. Critics warn of civilian casualties, legal ambiguities, and the erosion of privacy. The tension between safety and liberty, sharpened by bin Laden's actions, becomes a defining policy debate of the early 21st century. Within extremist circles, bin Laden's death creates both disruption and mythologizing. Some portray him as a martyr whose mission continues through decentralized affiliates. Others question strategic decisions that led to prolonged wars and civilian suffering in Muslim-majority countries. Al-Qaeda's central leadership struggles to maintain cohesion amid competition from rival groups like ISIS, which at its peak declares a self-proclaimed caliphate in parts of Iraq and Syria. The ideological landscape fragments, with factions disputing tactics, authority, and theological interpretation. Bin Laden's original vision of a unified global jihad becomes diluted in the face of regional rivalries and shifting priorities. You recognize that history rarely grants simple verdicts. For some in the West, bin Laden embodies pure malice, the architect of an atrocity that shattered lives and reshaped global security. For others, in parts of the Middle East and South Asia, the narrative intertwines with grievances about foreign intervention, authoritarian regimes, and unresolved conflicts. Yet even among those who share criticisms of Western policy, many reject his methods and the civilian toll of his campaign. The spectrum of interpretation underscores that individuals operate within broader currents, and their legacies are filtered through cultural, political, and generational lenses. As the 2010s advance, new global challenges emerge: financial crises, pandemics, rising geopolitical competition. The centrality of Al-Qaeda in global headlines diminishes compared to the immediate post-9/11 years, yet the institutional changes sparked by that period endure. Security infrastructure at airports remains strict. Intelligence agencies continue to prioritize monitoring extremist networks. Military veterans of Afghanistan and Iraq transition into civilian life, carrying personal memories of deployments shaped by a mission that began with the hunt for one man. In academic circles, analysts revisit early assumptions made after 9/11. Some argue that the framing of a global war on terror may have inadvertently elevated extremist groups by granting them the stature of strategic adversaries. Others contend that forceful action was necessary to disrupt imminent threats. The debate is not merely theoretical, it influences how governments respond to new forms of violence, including lone actor attacks and online radicalization. The methods of recruitment have evolved, with social media platforms becoming tools for propaganda and networking, far removed from the videotapes once released from Afghan caves. You reflect on how technology has transformed the landscape since 2001. The internet, still relatively young at the time of the attacks, has become ubiquitous. Information spreads instantly. Conspiracy theories circulate alongside verified reports. The absence of publicly released images of bin Laden's body fuels speculation in some circles, despite official confirmations. The digital age complicates consensus, fragmenting shared narratives into parallel realities. In Afghanistan, the return of the Taliban to power in 2021 prompts renewed examination of the war's trajectory. Critics question whether the initial objective, preventing Afghanistan from serving as a base for international terrorism, can be sustained under Taliban governance. Supporters of withdrawal argue that the original mission centered on dismantling al-Qaeda's core, and that this objective was largely achieved years earlier. The debate highlights how goals evolve over time, sometimes drifting from their initial clarity. You sense how the story of Osama bin Laden has become intertwined with broader themes: the limits of military power, the resilience of ideology, the complexity of nation-building. His actions forced nations to confront vulnerabilities in an interconnected world. They also triggered responses that reshaped international law, defense budgets, and diplomatic alliances. The ripple effects extend into areas he may never have fully anticipated, from biometric data collection to cybersecurity protocols. And yet, as time passes, memory softens at the edges for those who did not live through that September morning. Younger generations encounter 9/11 as history rather than lived experience. Museums and documentaries strive to convey urgency and emotion to audiences who know the event only through images. The challenge of preserving context grows. You understand that the responsibility of remembering falls not only on governments, but on individuals who carry stories forward. In the quiet space where you consider all this, the narrative feels less like a tale of a single villain and more like a complex web of cause and consequence. Osama bin Laden's life, from privileged beginnings to clandestine leadership, catalyzed forces that reshaped the 21st century. Yet those forces were not born solely from him. They were entwined with geopolitical tensions, historical grievances, and human choices on all sides. His death ended a man's chapter, but the questions his era raised about power, faith, justice, and security remain active, shaping decisions long after the helicopters left Abbottabad's darkened sky. You begin to feel the long arc of time bending toward reflection rather than pursuit. With Osama bin Laden gone and 2 decades of conflict behind it, the world he helped reshape settles into a complicated normal. The urgency that once dominated headlines has softened into analysis, commemoration, and recalibration. Yet the structures built in response to his actions remain deeply embedded in global systems. Intelligence agencies continue to operate with expanded authorities. Counterterrorism partnerships between nations endure, sharing data, monitoring financial flows, tracking digital communications. The machinery does not simply wind down, it becomes part of the permanent architecture of governance. In the United States, policymakers and military leaders assessed the cost of the wars that followed September 11. Trillions of dollars were spent across Afghanistan and Iraq, funding deployments, reconstruction projects, intelligence operations, and veterans' care. Thousands of American service members were killed, and tens of thousands wounded. Civilian casualties in Afghanistan and Iraq number in the tens of thousands as well, though precise figures remain debated. These numbers are not abstract. They represent families altered, communities reshaped. The pursuit of one man expanded into campaigns that transformed entire regions. You sense how strategic thinking evolves in response to those experiences. Future administrations grow more cautious about large-scale ground interventions, favouring limited operations, drone strikes, and special forces raids over prolonged occupations. The raid that killed bin Laden becomes a model of targeted action, precise, intelligence-driven, time-bound. Yet even targeted strikes carry consequences, sometimes inflaming local tensions or fueling narratives of foreign intrusion. The balance between minimising risk to one's own forces and minimising harm to civilians becomes a persistent ethical dilemma. Meanwhile, extremist movements continue to adapt. Though al-Qaeda's central leadership weakens, affiliates operate in Yemen, the Sahel, and parts of South Asia. ISIS rises and falls in territorial control, but leaves behind a network of supporters and ideological sympathisers. The nature of radicalisation shifts, increasingly mediated through online platforms rather than physical training camps alone. The digital sphere becomes a new battleground, where propaganda videos, encrypted chats, and algorithm-driven recommendations shape perceptions. Governments struggle to regulate content without infringing on freedom of expression. The fight moves from caves and compounds to servers and screens. You consider how bin Laden's original strategy aimed to provoke the United States into a costly entanglement that would expose vulnerabilities. In some respects, the prolonged conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq reflect the scale of response he sought. Yet the global order did not collapse as he envisioned. Instead, it adapted, sometimes clumsily, sometimes forcefully. The United States recalibrates its foreign policy priorities, increasingly focusing on competition with rising powers like China. Counter-terrorism remains important, but no longer dominates the strategic agenda as it once did. The psychological imprint of 9/11, however, persists. It influences how leaders interpret threats, how citizens respond to crises, how quickly emergency powers are invoked. When new attacks occur, whether inspired by foreign networks or domestic extremism, they are often framed through the lens of that earlier trauma. The language of never forget becomes both a pledge of remembrance and a guiding principle in policy debates. Commemorations each September reinforce continuity between past and present. In Pakistan, the Abbottabad raid continues to cast a shadow. Investigations and reports attempt to determine how bin Laden could reside there undetected for years. Official inquiries acknowledge intelligence failures but deny institutional complicity. The episode strains US-Pakistan relations, though cooperation continues in various forms. The compound itself is eventually demolished, erasing the physical structure but not the controversy surrounding it. You reflect on how the narrative of bin Laden has entered popular culture. Films, books and television series dramatize the hunt, sometimes blurring lines between fact and fiction. Public perception of intelligence work is shaped as much by storytelling as by declassified documents. This blending of history and dramatization influences how new generations understand the era. The image of helicopters silhouetted against the night sky becomes iconic, a shorthand for closure. Yet closure is never complete. Veterans of the wars grapple with physical injuries and psychological trauma. Afghan civilians navigate life under renewed Taliban rule, confronting uncertainties about governance, rights, and economic stability. Families of 9/11 victims continue to seek accountability through legal avenues, including lawsuits related to foreign support for the attackers. The legal and diplomatic threads extend far beyond the moment of bin Laden's death. You sense that the world has moved into a phase where the consequences of his actions are integrated into routine decision-making. Security briefings reference lessons learned. Crisis simulations incorporate scenarios shaped by past failures. Educational curricula include case studies of 9/11 and its aftermath. The event becomes a chapter in history books, yet one with living witnesses who carry vivid memories. At the same time, global attention shifts toward new challenges: climate change, pandemics, economic inequality. The central figure who once dominated headlines recedes into historical context. His name remains potent, but it no longer commands daily urgency. The transformation from immediate threat to studied subject reflects the passage of time. You begin to see that what changed America and much of the world was not solely the actions of one man, but the cascade of reactions that followed. Policies enacted in fear or determination reshaped institutions. Alliances strengthened or frayed. Technologies accelerated under the banner of security. Societies debated how much liberty to trade for protection. The echo of those debates continues in legislative chambers and public forums. As you sit with this understanding, the story feels less like a dramatic arc and more like a series of overlapping waves. The first wave was shock. The second was mobilization. The third was prolonged conflict. The fourth is reflection and recalibration. Each wave leaves residue, in laws, in infrastructure, in memory. Osama bin Laden's life intersected with these waves at a catalytic moment, amplifying tensions that were already present. And now, with distance, you can observe the broader pattern. The man who once spoke from hidden compounds sought to define the world through division. The world responded with force, with policy, with adaptation. The outcome is not simple victory or defeat, but a reshaped landscape in which security, identity, and global interconnection are viewed through a lens sharpened by tragedy. The helicopters have long since returned to base. The compound is gone, but the imprint remains, woven into the quiet routines of travel, governance, and collective memory that continue to unfold long after the night in Abbottabad faded into dawn. You arrive at the far edge of the story, where the noise of helicopters and collapsing towers has faded into something softer, more reflective, like distant thunder remembered rather than heard. Time has placed space between you and the man whose decisions once dominated headlines, and in that space you begin to see not only the violence and pursuit, but the fragile human threads woven through it all. Osama bin Laden is no longer a living presence in hidden compounds or grainy video recordings. He exists now as a historical figure, studied, debated, contextualized. Yet the world he altered continues to breathe, to argue, to rebuild, to question. You think about how a single morning in 2001 divided time into before and after. Before, there was a certain innocence in the way many societies understood distance and danger. After, there was vigilance. Airport terminals became corridors of scrutiny. Borders grew more layered with databases and biometric scans. Governments restructured themselves around the concept of homeland security. The language of risk entered everyday conversation. You may not feel it every day, but it lingers in subtle rituals, the removal of shoes at security checkpoints, the quiet awareness of emergency exits in crowded spaces, the brief hesitation when news alerts flash across your phone. Yet, alongside vigilance, life continued. Children born after 9/11 grew up in a world shaped by its consequences without carrying its immediate memory. For them, the towers are images in textbooks, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq chapters summarized in classrooms. The emotional intensity that once saturated the air has thinned, though it has not vanished. Memory becomes layered, with some carrying vivid recollections and others inheriting second-hand narratives. You sense that history has a way of smoothing sharp edges over time, not by erasing them, but by placing them within broader patterns. Bin Laden's life, from wealthy beginnings in Saudi Arabia to the remote compound in Abbottabad, followed a path shaped by conviction, grievance, and ambition. He believed he was waging a righteous struggle. Many across the globe saw only destruction and loss in his wake. The contrast between self-perception and consequence is stark. It reminds you how ideology can narrow vision, how certainty can harden into harm. The aftermath of his actions forced societies to confront uncomfortable questions. How do you respond to violence without amplifying it? How do you defend against threats that do not wear uniforms or claim territory in conventional ways? How do you preserve civil liberties while seeking safety? These questions did not end with his death. They continue to surface whenever new crises emerge. The framework built after 9/11, expanded intelligence powers, global counter-terrorism alliances, rapid response capabilities, remains a reference point for future decisions. At the same time, the human cost remains central. Families who lost loved ones carry private grief that does not diminish with geopolitical analysis. Veterans who served in distant deserts and mountains navigate lives marked by experiences few fully understand. Afghan civilians who endured decades of conflict live with the consequences of decisions made in capitals far away. The story is not only about a mastermind and a manhunt, it is about millions of ordinary lives intersecting with forces beyond their control. You begin to feel the narrative slow, not because its importance has faded, but because reflection requires quiet. The world did not end on September 11, nor did it reset on May 2nd, 2011. It shifted. It absorbed shock and adapted. Nations recalibrated strategies. Communities rebuilt skylines and routines. Over time, the extraordinary became woven into the ordinary. Security lines became just another part of travel. Military deployments became part of family cycles. The language of terror alerts gave way to new priorities. And yet, in certain moments, anniversaries, memorial ceremonies, the sudden silence during a reading of names, the weight returns. You imagine standing at the reflecting pools in New York, water falling endlessly into a square of absence. The design suggests continuity and void at once. It acknowledges loss without attempting to fill it. There is something instructive in that, an understanding that some absences remain, even as life moves forward around them. You think, too, about the nature of power. Bin Laden sought to provoke a superpower, to expose what he saw as fragility beneath dominance. In response, that superpower mobilized unprecedented resources, reshaped institutions, and pursued him across continents. Both actions, attack and response, revealed strengths and weaknesses. The conflict demonstrated how interconnected the modern world is, how actions in remote regions can reverberate globally within hours. It also showed the limits of force in addressing ideological movements that transcend geography. As you sit with these reflections, the story feels less like a tale of darkness and more like a meditation on consequence. Human beings make choices rooted in belief, fear, ambition. Those choices ripple outward, touching strangers who never chose to be part of the narrative. The responsibility of understanding such stories lies not in glorifying or simplifying them, but in examining them with clarity. The night grows quieter now. The urgency that once propelled this journey softens into something steadier. You recognize that history is not a straight line, but a web of intersections. Wars overlapping with political shifts, personal convictions colliding with global systems. Osama bin Laden was one node in that web, influential and destructive, but not singular in shaping the century. His life intersected with existing tensions and accelerated them. The world that emerged is more cautious, more technologically monitored, perhaps more aware of its vulnerabilities. And as you let the weight of it settle, you realize that the most enduring change may not be in policy or infrastructure, but in consciousness. A generation learned that oceans do not guarantee safety, that grievances ignored can metastasize, that responses to violence must be measured carefully to avoid perpetuating cycles. These lessons, imperfectly applied, continue to inform how nations and individuals navigate uncertainty. Now the story slows even further. The helicopters are distant memories. The compound walls have long been reduced to rubble. The names carved in bronze remain, steady and quiet. You breathe in, and the air feels ordinary again, not because the past has vanished, but because it has been absorbed into the ongoing rhythm of human life. The journey through fear, pursuit, and consequence settles into reflection. History does not whisper answers. It offers patterns, reminders, and caution. As the lights dim in your imagination and the narrative comes to rest, you are left not with the image of a single man, but with the understanding that choices, individual and collective, shape the world in ways that endure long after headlines fade. And in that quiet awareness, the story finally exhales.